So I'm Chris Green. I teach theology at Southeastern University in Lakeland, Florida. I am Pentecostal, born and raised Pentecostal, attended Pentecostal schools, taught at Pentecostal schools for the most part. But I'm a kind of unreliable Pentecostal. It doesn't tell you too much about me that I have gone to school there and worked in those schools. Something, but not everything. And most recently, I'm the author of Surprised by God. I wrote the book because my wife told me to do it. I gave a sermon, which is now a chapter in the book, called God is Not in Control. And after a lot of feedback from different people, my wife insisted that I write a book for a different audience than I had written for. I had a previous book where I started out attempting to write kind of more devotionally, and it turned into an academic book, and I couldn't help it. But she insisted that this book be readable and accessible for the people I was preaching to. And she wanted her friends to be able to read the book and engage with these ideas. And so she read every version of the book as it was, developing, and would often push back and say, no, that's too much. Come back this way a little bit. And I think somewhere in the middle of writing the book, I started to get in touch with the style that I wanted, the devotional feel, which I hope is pretty consistent throughout the book. That certainly, it felt like I was finding a voice to speak in those ways. And it's probably the most rewarding book that I've written because of that, because I had to work really hard to find a way to talk that was true to who I am and is rigorous in certain ways, but is also readable and accessible. And I owe most of that to my wife and her editing and her constant kind of feedback so that I could get a feel for how it was coming across and whether or not it was the right kind of tone. Because I didn't want anything that was too purple or too, kind of hyper devotional. And I've really been grateful for the feedback from those who have seemingly heard what I was trying to say, the way I was trying to say it. So I'm, again, really grateful to her for that help. Yeah, so the book began with the sermon, God is Not in Control, which was provoked by a bad sermon I'd heard about God being in control. And I thought, that can't be right, so we have to say something else. And what I tried to argue in that sermon and then later in the book is that God is sovereign, but sovereignty is not best understood through a metaphor of control. That control assumes a certain relationship of power dynamics that I don't think have anything to do with how God relates to us. So that's where it began. That was the seed. And then I started to think more and more about the need for us to reflect on God's nature. In my family, broadly speaking, Pentecostal family, we don't often think about God contemplatively. We don't often begin with the doctrine of God. We kind of assume all that and go on to other things like speaking in tongues or healing or exorcisms, exciting things movies are made of. But I've been convinced that the doctrine of God is absolutely essential, not in some academic way, but at the heart of our devotional life and the heart of our ministerial life. And so I wanted to find a way to speak to that. And again, my wife was insisting that I do that in a way that could be heard by the people that needed to hear it. And so that really guides all the chapters, I think. It's a bit eclectic. There's no linear development through the book. It's more maybe like a collage. But what holds the book together, I think, the spine of the book, is this idea that reflecting on God and God's nature is at the heart of all we do as Christians. Who God is and what God is like matters. And the more we attune ourselves to that, the better. When I refer to blindness in the book, I'm trying to name a kind of lack of experience or a lack of understanding of experience. Again, just my experience in church had always been the experience of God is the most important thing, that we long to have these encounters with God that mark us, that transform us. And I'd had some of those encounters, but I've always kind of found myself sympathizing with those who couldn't have those encounters or didn't know what to make of the encounters they did have. And so I think for a long time I've been drawn to the absence of God in terms of our experience, or the dark night, as St. John will talk about it. And I think coming on the language in John of blindness helped me find a way to speak to that in a very real way, there's something graceful about being blind to what you're experiencing. There are all kinds of risks involved in experiencing God. And there are all kinds of risks involved in not experiencing God, and yet both are equally graced. And I wanted to emphasize that, especially because in my context, it's not emphasized, right? I mean, it's downplayed or ignored altogether. So I think if you're going to grasp what I'm trying to do in the book, you need to have at least a feel for communities where there's so much emphasis on power and presence and victory and intimacy with God, and very little room often for suffering and uncertainty and the experience of loss. And I wanted to try to speak to that gap, to what was missing, it's at least as it seemed to me. That's the irony and the paradox at the heart of all this, is that actually the lack of experience of God is truer than the experience of God, because the experience of God is something very human. It's something we've taken in and interpreted. And the lack of experience of God witnesses to God's beyondness, to the way that God is more than our words can handle. And because of that, I want to cherish that experience of loss. There are some in the Christian tradition who are trained for that kind of work. I mean, they're contemplatives. They're trained to pray, and they spend their lives learning to pray contemplatively. But most Christians, at least most of the Christians I know, aren't monastics, and they're not contemplatives in that sense. But they do have experiences in their life, and lack of experiences in their life, that force them into this place. And I want to come alongside them and say, cherish that. I mean, this is a way of being in touch with God. In certain ironic sense, it's the most intimate way of being in touch with God, because you're no longer relying on any of your senses. You're not relying on your words or your ideas. You're just trusting that abyss that you sense, that nothingness that you sense, is actually full of presence, is full of God. And that we need not be afraid of that, right? I think that's, again, if I'm reading the room rightly, I think most people are afraid of that absence. And I want to say it's a faithful presence. Even if you don't experience it as presence, God is there. And again, I think there's something really beautiful about it if we will embrace it rather than kind of hold it at arm's length. I had been writing the book for a while. I knew I had the title of the book and the basic idea, but it wasn't until I was reading Teresa of Avila. I heard Rowan Williams give some lectures on Teresa, and I went and read his book and then started to read her. And she has this line about the world being on fire, and because of that, she wants to teach her sisters how to pray. And that seems so right to me, that in a time of serious social upheaval, not only in the United States but globally, that our instinct is to try to fix the problems we sense, to put out the fires, so to speak. And yet her instinct was, let's learn to pray again. And that seemed so right, that we turn to God when the world is on fire. And so once I read that line, I knew kind of where I was going to begin the book, because I wanted to stress that point first, that the future of activism is actually turning first to God. And I very much would affirm and call for an activist Christianity, a Christianity that's involved in the world. In fact, later in the book, there's a chapter about turning away from God for the sake of the world. But we can't do that until we've turned to God, I think, contemplatively, and meditate on who He is and what He is and what that means for us, and learn to experience the presence and absence of God in grateful ways. And something about that, I think, prepares us to be the kind of people who can be engaged. And there are all kinds of examples from the Christian history. Teresa is a great example. Thomas Merton is a recent example. These are people of deep prayer and deep social presence and activity. And that's what I would want. But to me, that all begins in prayer and comes back to prayer at the end.